this round.
There's no work.
I won't post it.
Yeah, so it would be funny to announce my plan.
I've got some here.
Did I ever see you after your staggering cable interview?
Did you go to Baxter funeral or you were manning the last
No,
time?
I went to the funeral before that.
How was it?
I saw Martin. Well, he really opened up, didn't he?
Yeah, he did. Yeah, he did. Right, thanks so much for staying. It's always a healthy sign after a break that you've all returned. I'm used to doing live things where if there's an interval, people disappear forever. So it's great to see you back here for the second session where we're looking at the future of journalism. And we've got the most fantastic panel for you. And the way we're going to do this is very similar to the first session, as far as I can gather. We'll talk for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes, and then open it up to questions. So let me introduce you to the panel. I think you know who they are. We've got Ian Katz, Deputy Editor of The Guardian, John Witherow, Editor of The Times, and Sarah Baxter, Editor of The Sunday Times magazine. And as I list the names, I'm reminded of what Michael Parkinson, some of you will know Michael Parkinson, probably not many actually, who said when he sat down on one of these suspiciously similar chairs that he always felt he was interviewing people more talented than himself, and so this is my experience now. I'm Steve Richards. I write columns for various things. I've also done, and this is where I thought we would start our discussion, if it's okay with the panel. I've just done a Radio 4 series, which is available on iPlayer, and frankly, you should all listen to it, called Making News. And I thought there are 3 episodes already on iPlayer. There's one more episode to come. It's going out on Tuesdays at 9 a.m. after today, the Today programme. And I thought I'd begin with a quote from Jon Snow, who was on the episode that was broadcast yesterday. And Jon Snow, the Channel 4 news presenter, described this era sort of counterintuitively in some ways as a golden age of journalism. He was incredibly excited by the range, by Twitter, by citizen journalism, by what you can now do on television, by the internet, and of course by newspapers. And I just wondered if I could begin by asking you, in this era where there is such a range, do you think when you look for journalists to come on your papers or whatever, that you are looking for a very different type of journalist in the light of this extraordinary expansion of the media? Ian, your mic might work, but I'm going to pass this on.
Give me 2 mics. Does that work?
Yeah. I think is it working?
Can you hear me all right? Is that okay?
Can everyone hear?
Okay, well, shout if you can't hear me. Take 2 mics. Okay, I'll always do what Jenny says. On the 2 mic principle. I mean, I am very much in the golden age of journalism camp. I mean, I think what's happening to journalism at the moment is that that journalism is exploding into something infinitely more powerful and exciting than it was when I started in journalism 20-something years ago. The bit that's not golden is the commercial side of it, which let's talk less about that because that's scarier. But I guess we will later on anyway. But I do think we can do things journalistically that we couldn't even have imagined 4 or 5 years ago, and I hope we'll talk more about that. In terms of what we're looking for in journalism, I always say to people who ask me what they should do to get on in journalism, I say learn Mandarin and learn multimedia. Those are the 2 things that we're looking for. People who are really comfortable with video, who can shoot their own video, cut it, edit it, and people who've got languages that are really valuable. That's crude, but I would say that's what we're after.
Right. John, you when you were editing the Sunday Times, I suppose, you were editing it for such a long time, you were there pre all this proliferation, and you've now moved to the Times. Do you look at your journalists differently in the light of this extraordinary expansion that has happened since you've been an editor of national newspapers?
Not really.
this whole digital revolution has been going on for some years now, and it applies to a Sunday newspaper as it does to a daily newspaper. I agree with Ian. I think this is a fantastic age for journalism. I think it's going to raise standards because people are under such scrutiny now. Anything you write, there are people who know a lot about it, probably more than you as a journalist, and they're going to comment on it, they're going to criticize it. You get anything wrong, you'll be picked up. So all the time, standards are rising in the quality of what you're reading about, which I think is fantastic. When I think back to what was deemed as a golden age of journalism, which was maybe the 50s and 60s, when newspapers dominated, and they would send correspondents all over the world, a lot of these guys would make up stuff. It was rubbish. And they got away with it, because nobody could scrutinize it, check it. You could go to the Congo and the wars that happened there, and you could write anything you liked, and the people of the Congo didn't know what you were writing, and the people back in Britain didn't know. And now it will be scrutinized at every level, so that journalism is so much better. And I'm not sure people out there realize that newspapers are so much better now than they were 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah.
And people still think, the golden age of the Sunday Times or the Guardian, and you'd go back and look at those newspapers, and there is some fantastic reporting in it, but it's exceptional. Most of the time it was pretty mundane.
Yeah.
Times was very mundane. Most of its history, I've got to say.
Until 3 months ago.
Until
3 months ago.
Yeah, newspapers now, the Guardian, the Sunday Times, the Times are much better newspapers than they used to be.
Yeah.
The quality of writing is that much better. But I'm not sure that's widely known outside of journalism.
Sarah, do you share this optimism? Because it's almost become a cliche now, and this wasn't reflected in the earlier session that you had, which was also quite optimistic. That, I keep on bumping into journalists who say they feel like miners must have felt in the 1970s, And yet we are being very upbeat, and on this programme, a series of interviewees were really excited about the potential for journalism. So explain that gap to me,
Well, for a start, the three of us still have a job, so we're feeling a little bit more complacent than some colleagues who don't. On the other hand, I absolutely agree it's a golden age of journalism. There's so much wonderful stuff, and I speak as the editor of the Sunday Times magazine. Last year we had our 50th anniversary, and there isn't a single editor of the Sunday Times magazine who hasn't been told that the old version of the Sunday Times magazine was better, their previous editor, or the previous editor before that, or the previous before that, etc., which is rubbish. It's all been great, and some of it's been better than others. But actually, it was great because it was a pioneer. It pioneered the photos of Don McCullen, etc. But now he inspired hundreds, maybe even thousands of photographers to go out and show what's going on in the world when he was just one of a handful. And similarly with writers, the explosion of long-form writing in magazines, has developed a pace so that it's now of really a quality. And I've seen great long-form writing on the web. I've seen it all over the place. And I've also seen brilliant articles, and they are articles, they're little stories of 140 characters on Twitter. And everybody can have their say. As John said, everyone can scrutinise everybody else. There are problems, and I do want to raise the commercial spectre because you were talking about journalists going to the Congo, etc. I remember some of the first stories I ever wrote. I went to see the Berlin Wall fall, and I paid for myself, and I found an angle, and I sold that story to The Independent. And I went off for some reason, I think because I knew someone who was going, on a trip with this Algerian leader called Ben Bella back to Algeria, and I boarded that ship, paid for it, and I sold it to The Guardian. Now, I think The Independent and The Guardian might still be interested in stories like that, but they'd be quite interested in me doing it as a citizen journalist. And even the Sunday Times, etc., might also say, well, yeah, fine, and and we might run it, we might not, but you wouldn't get paid for it in the same way. And so I think it's very, very difficult for people setting out on a journalistic career.
So there are two themes already surfacing: how you monetize this, and also a degree of optimism about the future of journalism. Could I ask each of you to sort of reflect a bit on what you see journalism becoming, if you see any change in it at all? John, for example, I've read at the Times, and you can never trust what you read in the newspapers. I don't know whether this is true. You can tell us. You want to focus more on those news pages. Tell us whether that's true or not. You wanted to make it newsier and sharper in news terms. If that is the case, aren't we sort of deluged with news? Isn't news in a way, and some of you I'm sure will want to be news journalists, but is the least significant, distinctive element of a newspaper now in this era of eternal rolling news?
It's a balance and a debate between how much news do you want and how much comment do you want. I mean, the argument you're implying is people are picking up all the news they want on the web. So when they come to a newspaper, you've got to have something different. That's true of a minority. A lot of people scrutinize the web during the day, and so if they come to their daily newspaper the next day and it's got all the same stories that are on the web, they think, what's the point of buying the newspaper? But in the case of the Times, the vast majority are not doing that.
Oh, really?
And they may be aware, and it's the same with the argument that went on when TV news came in, that there's the TV news, they know what the news is, therefore you've got to be different from the newspaper. It wasn't true. And there's greater truth, of course, in the written word on the web, that this has a greater impact on newspapers. But I don't think a newspaper should give up on news and then go entirely or mainly for comment. There's a case for doing that, and the Times has done that to a certain extent, that they'll run more analysis pieces, and we will increase the amount of comment. But I think the balance of news and comment isn't fundamentally going to change despite what's happening on the web.
Right. Do you agree with that, Ian? I mean, quite often people say they turn to paper, and indeed they do it with the Times, and in fact the Sunday Times, to get the take of this particular paper. Are you very conscious of that, or are you as conscious as you would have been 10, 20 years ago to the importance of news in The Guardian?
I mean, some sort of reflections coming out of the backbench tonight, where we were covering two stories really, the Thatcher funeral and the Boston bomb aftermath. We led the paper tonight on Jonathan Friedland's very interpretive piece about today's events. I think that speaks exactly to what we're talking about here. I can absolutely imagine that 3 or 4 years ago there would have been a convention that said it's absolutely got to be the sort of straighter news piece. So there is absolutely a move towards thinking about what is the added. I hate the word added value, so I'm going to avoid using it. What is the extra thing that we can bring you? You know, in the Indian, it might be you. For us, it was Johnny's interpretation of the day. But I also think that for years, as long as I can remember, I mean, we all remember Andrew Marr's attempt to turn the Independent into something like this. People have been saying that newspapers should be much more analytical, more comment-based, and generally those attempts have sort of failed over the years.
Yeah.
We are in a slightly different position, I think, perhaps to the Times, in that I think we think of ourselves as a website first, really, and a newspaper second, or we're certainly on the way to thinking of ourselves that way, which means that we don't hold any news back for the paper. So we tend to break news more or less when we can and when we have it. And that means we do have to think harder about what the newspaper proposition is the next day. But the one thing I would say is that I think it's a slightly narrow thing to talk about what newspapers will become like. I mean, the really interesting question is what journalism becomes like. Sure. And just 2 quick reflections on that. One is, going back again to this evening, when I was leaving the office this evening, there was a really interesting sort of mini media drama playing out on Twitter and other social media, which was about whether or not there was an arrest in the Boston bombing. Yeah. Some of you may have seen this. 3 or 4 big American news sources all reported that there was an arrest. Twitter effectively reported that there was an arrest to the extent that it reports these things. And actually, our New York team, for very old-fashioned reasons, i.e. because they couldn't get anyone in the FBI to confirm it, held out and said they didn't think there'd been an arrest, and it turned out there hadn't been an arrest. And there was an extraordinary moment where lots of old-fashioned news organisations had egg on their face. Twitter looked rather silly. And I thought, wow, what a great illustration of what old-fashioned journalism can do in a world of social media. And so I think there is a sort of role that we have for just doing the kind of old-fashioned checking and verification in this very frenetic, febrile environment. And the other role that I'm perhaps most excited about is the one that we can perform as conveners of a kind of much more loose sort of network of journalism that happens around us. and maybe this is something to talk about later, but we've had lots of stories which have emerged from Twitter tips, really. And the way that those happen is by placing yourself at the centre of a discussion and bringing those things to you and then doing old-fashioned journalism with them.
It's interesting, though, that you include the need for old-fashioned journalism as part of the formula, as did Jon Snow in this thing I was doing with him, where he was raving about the golden age of journalism. He said it all has to be mediated by professional journalists, and presumably you would concur
the
with
best
that.
example, I mean, and the one that I found deeply Rush, in those dark moments when you wonder really where you are going to fit into this terrifying new world, the most reassuring moment I had was the McAlpine story, which was probably slightly painful and miserable for the BBC, but you'll all recall that Newsnight said that an unnamed Tory peer had been involved in this paedophile scandal in North Wales. Twitter collectively very quickly put two and two together and worked out they were talking about Lord McAlpine, and pretty quickly it was as good as reported. And it was a reporter at The Guardian, David Lee, who sadly left last week, but who had 30 years of experience and could reach back and say, I remember 20 odd years ago when this was handled at a public inquiry, I remember McAlpine's name surfacing, and I remember there was something wrong with that, and I remember that we got excited about it and then realised it was wrong. And he said, this doesn't smell right, and then spent the next week furiously worrying away at it, and by the Thursday or Friday of that week had revealed that it was a case of mistaken identity. And it was the most powerful demonstration of how I think old journalism really still matters in this world.
John, could I ask you, now you've moved to the Times from the Sunday Times, and I know there's a unique pressure about editing a Sunday paper, but how much pressure do you feel from Twitter and other media? I mean, we've had the example from Ian about the Boston thing probably being wrong. On Sunday, I think people were tweeting that this guy in Number 10 who was working with Cameron, Andrew Cooper, was leaving, and then it turned out that he wasn't. And there was a whole Twitter storm about the significance of his departure, and he hadn't even departed. And yet, if you were working as a news editor that Sunday on The Times or The Guardian, there would have been a pressure to do something about this and whether Number 10 was imploding, before you discover a few hours later that it's not true. Now, I think it might be true in a few months' time, actually, but I mean, that's another side to the story. I mean, how do you feel this on a daily, the pressure of this kind of thing?
Yeah, it kind of adds to it, but this has always happened. In journalism, you're always picking up rumours, and Twitter is just a means of disseminating rumours.
Yeah.
And this happens almost all the time. Somebody says, I've heard this, can you check it out? Now it's coming on Twitter, this is a rumour, can we check it? So I don't think it fundamentally changes anything. It comes back to the basic principles of good journalism. You have to stack it up. And I think the merits, if we're going to look at what emerges in this new media world, is that old-fashioned journalism that can check it and stand it up and be accurate is going to win over the rumours that are wrong. And I think as increasingly there are all sorts of forms of communication. This is why I believe fundamentally that titles like The Times and The Guardian will survive and flourish, because they can deliver other forms of journalism that you won't get by so-called citizen journalism. Because you do have skills, as David Lee had. People have skills and they learn to avoid certain stories and not touch them. And in the end, people want to believe what they read.
Sarah, what about magazine journalism? Because of all the things that presumably cannot translate very easily onto the net, the magazine is the most vivid example. It's glossy, there's lots of good photography. You commission quite long pieces which are reinforced when you read it in a magazine. Is it your sense that for some of the audience here, magazine journalism in all its manifestations, including yours, is in a strong state or is as vulnerable as the rest of it?
I think it's as vulnerable as the rest, but it's by no means more vulnerable than the rest. It's one of the great myths that people don't enjoy long-form journalism on the web. Some of the most read pieces in the world are several thousand words long. The New York Times published a piece over Christmas that was something like 15,000 words long and had 3 million readers, called Snowfall, about an avalanche. And
Really?
some of our some of our stories have gone around the world. John Arledge did an expose of Goldman Sachs that had 1 million readers worldwide, and in fact that's the great thing. It was as widely read on the web in America as it was in Britain.
How many words was that, for example?
7,000 words.
So it was a big piece.
Yes,
Yeah.
and 1 million readers, and it had a big impact in New York, where Lloyd Blankfein, the CEO, and his obituary comes. It will say, oh, he said he was doing God's work about banking, and that was just one article, and we would not have been able to go around the globe like that if it wasn't for the web. And also, photography magazines, they look wonderful on tablets. So there's a very promising future there as well. And I've often found that I get led to long-form articles on Twitter that are in other publications, maybe American, maybe from another part of the world. And I find it's a great test, because if I get excited about them, I click on, and I'm using my iPhone. If it keeps me engaged for several thousand words on my iPhone, I know it's a winner.
It works.
So it's either good journalism or it isn't. It either engages you or it doesn't. And I don't think we should worry too much about platforms in that sense.
Yeah. Let's just very briefly, and then we'll open it up to all of you. Leveson. John, I was bumped into one of the Tory MPs who actually was pro-Leveson the other day, George Eustace, friends with Cameron, but pro-Leveson, who was telling me that if you all don't get your act together in a way that I hadn't quite realised, the legislation triggers some alternative sequence in 3 months' time or something. So let me just ask you, one way or another, do you envisage some kind of new regulatory structure in place quite soon, or do you sense that the whole thing is just going to go away?
I think there's a really worrying mood out there amongst the establishment and politicians, and it is revenge. I mean, these are long-held resentments. A lot of them are held against newspapers and journalists. The expenses scandal has exacerbated it. And when you get them all combining, as they did on that infamous night, Sunday night, when they had Hacktoff in there, and they cooked up a deal that was fundamentally against press freedom and freedom of expression, I think there's a mood there that wants to punish the press, and they think that this is their one opportunity in a generation. And they're determined to do it. Whether they're going to succeed is going to be very interesting, because Harriet Harman was saying yesterday before a select committee, if we don't sign up for a voluntary system, they'll impose one on us.
Well, that's what George Eustace said to me would happen.
Yeah. Well, look, if we want to go back to licensing newspapers, which we haven't had for hundreds of years in this country, it's going to cause a tremendous row. Already what they're proposing is attracting opprobrium around the world from everybody. I had a bunch of African journalists in my office last week, and they were saying this is one of the worst things that's happened to them. In Tanzania, they torture journalists. In Kenya, they're worried about their freedoms. In Uganda, and they're saying anything that goes through in Britain will encourage political leaders in these countries to take much tougher lines.
Of course, Ian, I mean, The Guardian exposed a lot of the things that triggered Leveson, but I read The Guardian itself is now having some doubt about all the various possible frameworks that might surface at the end of this process.
Yeah, I mean, we've got lots of reservations about the way things have panned out, and I think would agree with John that slightly bizarre late Sunday night over the pizzas in Ed Miliband's office with a large contingent of hacked off was perhaps not the smartest way to have gone the final furlong in this really kind of long process. I mean, to go to your original point, I'd be amazed if there is the political will to do something draconian, as it were, before the election. But I do differ, I think, from John in that, I mean, as I understand it, and John was in these meetings and I wasn't, but the editors, by and large, agreed to most of what was in this final settlement, as it were. Certainly, the idea of a royal charter, I know you were never gung-ho about, but you swallowed the idea of a royal charter. And the only things that moved beyond that, as I understand it, in the final Sunday night were the exemplary damages issue, and there's some discussion obviously around the ability to dictate apologies. But I'm genuinely slightly puzzled by why the move from a royal charter, which can be changed at the whim of a government and the Lord Chamberlain, is that much better than a royal charter which can be changed with a majority of the whole House of Commons. And I'd love to know why you think that.
It's a slightly specious argument. The government has come up. Look, regulation is really boring. I know this, so we won't go. But the idea that you need 2/3 of Parliament to change this, it's not true, because of course no Parliament can hold the subsequent Parliament to account. So any Parliament can come in and reject that with a simple majority. So it doesn't amount to very much. I mean, it's simply the fact that they're trying to impose at all sorts of levels much tighter regulation than we've agreed to. What we were agreeing to was almost all of Leveson, and the press has signed up to that, which is far further than is than.
But which are the specific points on which the agreement goes beyond what you had already agreed to?
It was the composition of the Code Committee, how you made that up, which is very important, because if you have self-regulation, journalists should decide what that code should be. And out of all the Leveson hearings, there was no criticism of the journalist code, which we all sign up to. And yet the new proposals put forward by Hacktorf have much greater control over that code, so that journalists are not the ones really controlling it. It will be outsiders. That's not self-regulation. That's outsiders deciding what journalists should be writing. And I think that's unacceptable. There are various other just tightening elements that, when you look into the detail over time, will make a fundamental difference to freedom of expression.
Okay, we'll open it up now. Let me just ask Sarah, before we do, on something which surfaced at the very beginning, how the hell all of this makes money in the future. I mean, you both charge on you have to pay for the Sunday Times and the Times. And it's not very much, actually. I'm not being sycophantic. I do it quite happily. I don't notice
Well said.
But I'm amazed at the number of people, including really wealthy people, who will not do it, who find it offensive that they are being charged. I mean, it's crazy, in my view, and worrying. So how the heck... I mean, are more and more people paying up for it, or not?
Well, more and more people are
Are
paying
they?
up for it. That's the good news. The more people are paying up for it on the other side of the Atlantic. The New York Times is getting quite a lot of paid-for subscribers, but not enough. We'd like to see more. And there's this ludicrous idea going around that all journalism should be free, and that you can access
crazy.
it as if it doesn't cost anything for me to keep my family alive, or for Don McCullum to go and hang out in Vietnam. And you know what it's not free anyway. The ludicrous fallacy is that the advertisers are going to pay for it all. Now, firstly, they're not paying for it all, so that the papers that are relying on advertising are losing bucket loads of money. And secondly, at what point did it become progressive or in any way in the interests of honest journalism to be wholly owned by your advertisers? I mean, I believe in the punter reaching into his pocket and paying £1 or getting out their credit card for the digital subscription because they believe in the product. And then that's our relationship with the readers. We have a very good and close relationship, I believe, with readers. I don't want my closest relationship to be with the advertisers. And I think that is fundamentally a worrying problem for the future of journalism.
Okay, since you stated that so clearly, could I just ask Ian, forget about the editorial thinking, but the commercial thinking of the fact, I bet everybody in this room probably goes onto your website. You actually have the paper there, which you can look at for nothing, and all the comment and the news stories and the sport and the arts there for nothing. Well, Sarah's put the case for charging. Just very briefly, and then we'll open it up to all of you.
Well, we're not free because we have some kind of philosophical idea that journalism has to be free. We don't have an ideological position on that. Ours is a much simpler commercial bet that it's better to have a very big audience and try to find other ways of commercialising it than to charge a little bit of money to a small number of people, sacrifice a huge amount of reach. And I don't know, because I don't think you guys publish. Do you guys publish your web? So I mean, maybe you can give a comparison. I mean, the Guardian. The Guardian now has about 70 or 80 million unique users.
Astonishing figure.
A month, which makes us, depending on whether you count the China People's Daily or Xinhua, the third or the fifth biggest news organization in the world. I mean, it's an unimaginable leap from the position that we had as a newspaper when I joined, which was as the sort of seventh or eighth biggest or the third smallest newspaper in the British newspaper market. So it's completely transformative for us to be free in terms of our international reach. We give up the equivalent of newspaper cover price, what you take in a paywall subscription, and the challenge to us is to make that back in a combination, not just of advertising. We're not slaves entirely to our advertisers. We make money back from you all, I hope, in dating, in selling you stuff, and that's the really big challenge for all of us, is to invent new ways of turning all these millions of eyeballs to account. I'll stop.
Great, thank you. Well, there we have two contrasting views. Now let's open it up to all of you. Blimey, right? Okay, I'm going to take three at a time. The mic will come around. If you could keep it as short as possible, so we get as many of these in, and if you could say who you are and where you're from, and then a question just there. Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I'm Mira, I'm the editor at Pi, which is UCL's magazine. There are so many sort of student writers and online bloggers, and I just wondered, what does it take to get into a paper? Because there obviously are so many journalists who are willing to write for free. So then what's that sort of special quality that gets you into a sort of paid role with a newspaper?
Where you're paid for your journalism.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. On this side now, yeah, just there, and then we'll go back, and then we'll do another round.
It's really encouraging.
Sorry,
James Evans from the Boar at Warwick. It's really encouraging for you all to be talking about a new golden age of journalism and new forms of journalism like citizen journalism. But how do we embrace that as up-and-coming journalists without it costing our opportunity for a paid job?
Okay, there's an interesting focus on paid work here. Totally understandable. Standing at the back, the woman at the back with. The mic will come up. Just say who you are and then we'll do another round in a second.
I'm Laura Hughes, editor of Noose. How important are our degrees? I think I speak on behalf of most people in this room when I say that my degree has suffered as my commitment to student journalism has increased.
Well, there's a real common theme in those three. There we have a worthy discussion about press regulation and paid journalism in this world of citizen journalism where you can get stuff very cheaply or for nothing. Well, let me put a broader point about that. Are you willing to pay for your journalism when you can get it for nothing? I mean, you all commission.
No. Look, the merit of doing this is if you want to get a job in a newspaper or on a website or something, you've got to show what you've done. And if we're looking, the Times runs a graduate training scheme. It will look at degrees to an extent, but we're trying to get away from being Oxbridge orientated or anything like that, or the top Russell universities. We're looking for talent. We don't really care where it comes from, as long as people show they're kind of determined, inquisitive, and are putting a lot of stuff out there. There's a guy we hired who took the time from his university to do bare knuckle fighting, and to write about it, and he did brilliantly. He went undercover, but he didn't go to a top university, and I don't know what degree he got, but he's a fantastic journalist. So I think we have to be open to this sort of thing. We're looking for people who have those abilities, and who show that they can write and blog and do all these kinds of things. It's not so different from the way it was in the past, but you've got to show that you're out there.
I just commissioned a piece by a young 23-year-old because I was impressed by what he'd done on the web. And he came to see me and probably spent all his weekly money on a train fare from up north down to London. And I was just curious. I asked him, I said, had you done a lot of journalism at university? He said no. But when he left, he decided that that was what he was interested in. And he started reading a lot of websites. And he started writing to websites, suggesting ideas. And then most of them they didn't want, but he'd suggest some more. And then he'd get cleverly said, oh, one person is looking at this and considering, person economist is considering running this, and that got the attention of someone somewhere else at running that. And this was very enterprising of him. And when he approached me, he sent me a list of 5 ideas, one of which was pretty interesting. The other 4, not so much. But he had this idea of, he'll keep knocking at the door, and if someone says no, he'll say, okay, that's not a good one, what about this one? Well, that's what when John was my boss, used to have to do every week with John. He'd say, oh, I don't think so. I don't think so, Bax. I said, okay, what about this one? So I kind of liked his spirit, I liked his style, and I'm giving him a chance. And I will pay him for it if I publish it. Now, I won't pay him for it if I don't.
Right. Well,
And then the other thing, what I would add is, if you get rejected, which you will, don't give up. When I started out in journalism with Reuters, and they had a training scheme, and I was rejected, and I wrote to them saying, this is outrageous. This is the only course I've applied for. How can you reject me? And they came back, and it's a sort of curious thing about the Brits. They will say, okay, well, we'll send you on the Cardiff journalism course instead, which they did. And when I applied to the Times in about 1980, they rejected me, and I wrote back saying, I really want to work for the Times, I'll work for you for free. And they were so embarrassed by that, they called me back in and said, no, you can't have anybody working for free, but we'll give you a job. So keep going.
Someone asked about degrees. My wife is the cleverest person I know. She got a third. Several of the absolute cleverest people I know got a third. So I'm personally intensely relaxed about degrees. To go to the, I think you guys are in some ways slightly unfortunate because you've arrived, if you are interested in going to journalistic careers, at a moment that most of us in traditional media have very little capacity to hire new people, which is really miserable. But the great advantage you have over us, I think, as a generation of journalists, is that you don't need traditional institutions to get going. And so the most powerful single thing you can do is just start. Yeah. Start blogging, start making film, start mucking about with data, start doing stuff. And the only people that we've hired, very few people in the last few years in a world where traditional newsrooms have been contracting. One of them, James Ball, was standing somewhere there a moment ago. And James was a no-brainer. We had to hire him. We had to find the resources to hire him because he was someone who could do something that no one else in our entire building could do, which was to take a vast database and make sense of it, work out how to comb it intelligently for stories. So there are all these skills that we all desperately know we need to fill, and we don't have, and we're always on the lookout for. The other person that we hired recently, and I hesitate to mention this lest tomorrow morning I'm faced with a deluge of these, but just built a website devoted to explaining why The Guardian needed to hire him. He's a Dutch. I commend it to you. If you want to see the most effective job application self-promotion I've ever seen, Google it. He's a guy called Dan, D-A-A-N, and he produced an entire interactive devoted to explaining why A, he was the most talented interactive in the world, and B, why he had to be employed by The Guardian, and of course we couldn't resist.
Okay, so you can don't worry about your degree. Screw it up, it'll be fine. One of the messages come out here. Okay, let's have another 3. Yeah, the guy there in the beard, and with the beard, in the beard, with the beard.
How important do you think investigative journalism is? Do you think it's the thing, Ian Katz, that's going to add value to newspapers?
Yeah, interesting, good question. Let's move over there with the glasses here at the front. Sorry, I've got to make distinctive.
Hello, this is Lloyd Ramos, creative director at Queen Mary's Key Messenger. It's interesting that photojournalism is being mentioned quite a lot as a strength for print media, and in fact, Don McCullen's name has been mentioned and thrown around quite a lot. I find it interesting because Don McCullen would say that the current media is sort of obsessed with celebrity rather than covering serious news events. And would you say that's a symptom of the mentality that the public have towards the media, or is it something more aligned with commercial interests?
What, the focus on so-called
Yes,
celebrity journalism? Yeah, that's an interesting question. Right, let's go the guy right at the back, because you're in a disadvantageous.
Thanks very much. I just like to say I liked making news, and I'll continue to listen, and everyone else should too. It's great.
Oh, thank you very much.
Do listen in.
You can have as long as you want.
Oh,
with your
thanks very
question.
much. Well, in that case, my name's William Houston. I'm the political director of the Student Journals, which, correct me if I'm wrong, is the only non-affiliated outlet here. So, yay for the Student Journals. Siraj created it, so you should definitely hire him to be on The Guardian. And my question is, could the panel, we've heard from John Witherow, but from the others, how you got into journalism? Was there one thing, or were you involved at university and it just developed out of that? Thanks.
Okay, right, all very interesting questions. Do you want to answer that one specifically, John, and then we'll go into
Which one?
the last one first, so to speak. Then I'll ask some of the others perhaps about
Yeah,
investigative. Okay, you want to do that one.
I really want to talk about investigative journalism.
Right, okay, do both.
I'll do the 30-second version of I got into journalism by, like you guys, doing, I was going to say like you guys, doing lots of terrible student journalism, but I'm sure lots of you doing fantastic student journalism. I did terrible student journalism. And then, rather like the chap who Sarah described, I pestered a lot, and I was lucky enough. And it seems like another age when new newspapers were being launched. Can you believe that? There was a time when new newspapers were being launched.
Yeah.
And Steve's paper had not got around to launching a Sunday newspaper, and there was a Sunday newspaper launched called the Sunday Correspondent, which I'm sure... Does anyone in this room remember the Sunday Correspondent? Oh, there you are. Thank you, Stephen. I didn't have you in mind. It was a short-lived Sunday newspaper, and I wrote a sort of ghastly, pushy letter to them saying, you're a new newspaper, you need to have new talent. And they rather sweetly agreed to see me, and then decided they would have one student traineeship, which they split between me and another journalist called Jonathan Friedland, who went on to rather more glamorous things afterwards. Can I just speak to your investigative journalism question? I can't remember who it was who asked it.
That was the first one.
I think,
We'll come to the others.
I absolutely think that investigative journalism is a horrible word because it implies that there is some subset of journalism which is about finding out about stuff and the rest of it isn't. I mean, I use investigative journalism to mean the really quite slow burn, resource-intensive, sort of long-term beavering away at difficult stories. And I absolutely believe that's the heart of what we do. And I think, and it's defining of what we do. Now, there's two problems associated with it. One is it's incredibly difficult to fund. It's incredibly expensive. Investigative journalists produce a relatively small number of words in a year, and often they're the most important words that you run all year. But actually, it's expensive, and they often need lots of support, and they need legal support, and they need expert support. It's really expensive. So the big challenge going forward for all of us is how we fund that part of what we do. And that's where what's really encouraging is what we're seeing around the world now, which is increasing not-for-profit foundations supporting investigative journalism. I'm sure lots of you saw that one of them just won a Pulitzer in America this week. ProPublica in the States has had an amazing record. So what we're really going to have to do is to find more imaginative ways of funding that stuff, but it must be at the core of what we do. The one other thing I would say about it is that I think there was a moment of anxiety for lots of journalists 4 or 5 years ago when people started to ask what the value of a scoop was on the internet. I mean, if you could produce a wonderful story, if John's newspaper could produce a wonderful story on the other side of the paywall, and we could, I won't say copy it out, but report it on the open side of the paywall 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 20 minutes later, what really is the value of that story to the Times? It's clearly not what it used to be. It's obviously defining, and people will still recall that it's a Times story, but it doesn't have the same power that it used to have in a world where we could hold it back, put it in our newspaper, and when you went to the newsstand, it was the only paper that had that story. And I think there was a real sort of panic across the news industry that actually this was really undercutting the power of original news. And I think the most interesting thing I've seen in the last year or so, and it feels like a very fresh development, is that some of the people who were most skeptical about the value of that kind of news, and these were the people who drove the blogging revolution, these were the sort of people who drove organizations like the Huffington Post, people like BuzzFeed, if you look at what BuzzFeed's doing now, BuzzFeed is investing in original reporting. They've hired some of the best American political reporters to do original reporting because they've made a bet, which is that the social web, the social internet, as distinct from the search-driven internet, rewards originality in a way that the internet of 3 or 4 or 5 years ago didn't do. And to me, this is a hugely, hugely exciting development, because I think if the premise here is that if you're going to tweet a story or Facebook a story, you're going to more likely to tweet the original or Facebook the original, it starts to restore the value to the kind of reporting that we all value most, and I find that very exciting.
John, can I ask you, when you have, as an editor, an exclusive now, whether it was on the Sunday Times or now the Times, is your instinct to sort of hold it back for the printed edition, or to get it out there by 8 o'clock the night before? I mean, and if it is that, are you less interested now in the scoop or the deeper investigative journalism type of story?
No, not at all. Both Sunday Times and the Times have a real dedication to investigative journalism. I mean, on the Times, I inherited from James Harding a fantastic investigative setup. I mean, last year the Times did some amazing stories on the paedophile gangs, on tax evasion, and that was steady investment in journalism. Unlike Ian, I wouldn't put it up straight away on the web. I think there is a merit in holding it back. I don't think, of course, websites will pick it up very quickly. I don't think ultimately it changes things very much. They still remember the papers, where it came from, and who's investing in it. And both the Guardian and the Times do invest in investigative journalism, and it matters. It matters to how the papers are viewed, the credibility. I mean, the Guardian has a fantastic international readership, but the counter to that on the Times side is we're behind a paywall. But if you look at what's happening to our readership, that they're paying for content, it is probably the only newspaper, certainly in this country and maybe internationally, where we are flat or increasing those who are paying for our content. And that's a pretty significant development. We have 150,000 people paying for subscriptions, and we have almost 400,000 paying for the paper. We are almost growing, and in the current climate of newspapers, that is remarkable. So that's there is a positive message out there.
Yeah, Sarah, do address the investigative one. Could you? Because I want to have one more round of questions, then we've got to get out of here. Could you also address this? I mean, it is a common issue raised, either in a negative way or a positive way, that newspapers, in order to sell, including so-called upmarket newspapers, focus more and more on celebrity because they think that will sell in this very competitive market. Is it true? Is it worrying if it is true, or what?
Well,
to answer that particular
it's
question.
It's absolutely true that celebrity sells. It's also true that scoops sell and get journalists going like nothing else. So we'll never give up our addiction to scoops. Don McCullen, whose photos are on this wall, I admire enormously as a photographer. But with all due respect, Don, he was talking absolute rubbish. He was talking rubbish from day one of the Sunday Times magazine, which launched his career, which had on its first cover a picture of Jean Shrimpton, the celebrity model of the day. And when we had our 50th anniversary exhibition at the Saatchi Gallery, which I'm proud to say that 300,000 people came to see, his pictures were on the wall alongside Terry O'Neill's pictures of Faye Dunaway, Snowden's pictures of Ali McGraw. I mean, celebrity, they had them then, we have them now. BuzzFeed, which Ian Katz talked very interestingly about, is an amazing website dedicated on the one hand to lots of pictures of cats, and on the other hand was the place where I first spotted a very good long-form article by this 23-year-old who ended up having 50,000 readers on BuzzFeed for his 3,000-word piece. And they're developing in very interesting ways, I think, these website providers, where BuzzFeed is now doing serious political journalism. It's becoming, in a sense, a newspaper of the web and offering that same variety that we offer. Fascinating. Huffington Post, its dirty little secret is that it has, quite a few semi-pornographic celebrity photographs alongside its very kind of quite hectoring political journalism. And, it's got very left-wing values coming through Arianna Huffington, but it's got the values of the Daily Mail scroll of shame when it comes to content. So this is journalism in all its glory. It's one of the things I love about it.
And hasn't really changed from what you're saying.
No, it hasn't changed
the
a bit.
history of the Sunday Times
It was
magazine.
always thus, it always will be thus.
Okay, three more very quickly. Yeah, you've had your hand up for ages. Yeah, and then we'll go.
I wanted to ask, we had the younger panel on earlier and they were terribly impressive. Now we have you talking about serious topics, but I was wondering just to bring you back to big serious topics and just to remind us that there was a time when you were like us and made mistakes and weren't the leading lights of British journalism. Could you tell us each a story about a time, just a brief story, when you messed something up and you thought, this is it, my career in journalism is over, and yet you recovered and you're where you are now?
Right, good question, and we'll have that as the last set of answers. Over here, and start talking. So we're running. Have we got to be out of here? I think we've got to be out of here in a minute.
Lauren,
so
I'm from UCL's Pi magazine. More and more younger generations are seeking visual stimulation, and their concentration spans becoming shorter. So how do media
concentration spans becoming shorter because of Twitter and things like that.
So how do news corporations intend to maintain interest in the printed newspaper?
Yeah, it is. Twitter is making us all much less. Yeah, just a bit further back there. Yeah, where the mic is, just for speed.
Hi, Aidan Phillips from Forge Press. I want to ask, do you think that journalists nowadays have enough time to do their stories properly, to check the facts, to understand the context, and to get it across to the reader?
Yeah, all good questions. Right, I want you all to answer the mistake that you made that you can now relive and tell in a relatively relaxed environment without too many disastrous consequences arising from the confessions. Before then, accuracy in the speed of things. Who quickly wants to address that one?
You're holding the mic.
John.
Accuracy, yes, of course. I mean, that's what we have to do. And I can't think of any other way of really saying it. We have to check it and get it right. It's pretty simple. That's all about credibility.
Yeah. Okay. What was the other one before the mistakes? About Twitter. Oh yeah, that's really interesting.
What Sarah was saying about people willing to read even on an iPhone a 4,000 or 5,000 word piece. I'm not sure it's true about the shorter attention span. Yes, in some cases people do flick back and forth, but I certainly find on Twitter, if you go to an article and it's a long article, you'll read it if it's interesting enough. And that all comes back to good journalism. How do you write it? How do you find the subject? How do you have a headline that draws people in? And once you're in it, people will read thousands of words. So I'm not sure it's true. It's sort of become accepted as a truism, but I'm not sure it is.
Ian, could I ask you, you tweet a lot, and actually you tweet quite a lot when you're immersed in quite a significant story for The Guardian. I noticed you tweeted a lot during the whole newspaper crisis when The Guardian was breaking through. Have you found that Twitter has affected almost the way you think as a journalist on a sort of hour-to-hour basis, which is a slightly different question, but not entirely, that we do just think very...
I think a lot of us now use Twitter almost as a notebook. I mean, it's almost the things that you would record in your own notebook to act on later, but you're sharing them publicly, so it's showing your workings as you're going through the day. But I found Twitter incredibly liberating and powerful as a sort of way, as a constant sounding board. I mean, it can be exhausting and irritating, but it's a constant sounding board in a sense of where a story is moving through a day and how you should respond to it. Can I just leap in on the speed question?
Yeah, and accuracy.
I think there is a point in there, and I think the philosophy of web journalism for the last few years has been driven by the sort of idea of not wrong for long. Go as quickly as you can, correct as quickly as possible, and certainly that's been our kind of motif. And I think that generally what the web has done is it's forced journalism to be either very live or much more considered, and what it's squeezed is everything in the middle, which tends to not do very well online. I sense a slight change happening in that now. I think we are going too fast, and I think that not wrong for long philosophy is coming under a bit of pressure, and that we might all start feeling, let's just cool your boots and do a bit more work before we publish.
Yeah, that it was Sky who had that first of all, wasn't it? Not wrong for long. It began with rolling television news. That whole idea.
I think this. I think Boston. I actually think a story that we had tonight that I mentioned earlier, in which 3 major U.S. networks and the Associated Press all reported something that wasn't the case. I think if you watch how the next couple of days play out, I think there'll be a bout of navel gazing about that, and I think it will. I think we will all just hit the brakes ever so slightly, and I think that'll be a good thing.
Can any of you remember some terrible early mistake that you can reveal?
How long you got? I can very clearly remember. I became editor of the Sunday Times in '94, and within weeks of getting it, a man called Gordievsky came to us with a book, in which he exposed somebody you probably haven't heard of called Michael Foote. He alleged was a KGB agent, and we latched onto this. This is a fantastic story. In fact, they had in the Kremlin, he said, Foote's agent name was Agent Boot, which is almost too good to be true. And in my enthusiasm and naivety, I leapt on the story and kicked the hell out of it and made a tremendous mistake. And the Guardian had enormous fun with it, as did everybody else. And Foote sued successfully, very easily. And we had to capitulate because we overcooked it. I remember having this fantastic conversation with Rupert Murdoch soon afterwards when he said, "John, you seem to have screwed this up a bit." And I said, "Yeah, Rupert, I think I have." And I think here comes the sack. This is about 3 months into it. And then he said, "He's not a greedy man, Michael Foote, is he?" And I said, "I don't know. I don't think he is." And that was the last thing he said about it.
That was it?
That was it.
How greedy was he?
Well, he got a hell of it. He got one of those extensions that I love talking about.
Yeah. Sarah? Could you?
Well, I can remember one that I wish was a lot longer ago. I was in Washington for the Sunday Times, and I was reporting on the 2008 election. And anyway, John McCain was absolutely tanking. His campaign was broke. His advisors were at war. And I'd received what I considered to be excellent sources that said that he was going to pull out. And I wrote that he was going to pull out of the campaign. Well, within about 2 weeks of that, actually, thanks to the web, that story ran around America, despite originating in a British newspaper. And everyone was talking about it. You know, Fox News, is John McCain going to pull out, etc. I think it actually might have secretly given him a bit of a bounce back. Not only did he not pull out, he went on to trounce everybody else, become the Republican candidate. And I was so mortified by this and so embarrassed that then I thought, God, I've absolutely ruined my access for the next God knows how many months, that I actually got on his campaign bus on New Year's Eve through New Hampshire, because I figured I'd be one of about 3 journalists there. And I could try and sort of make it up to him, try and sort of establish I was okay, really, and you know, might be still have some useful things to report about the McCain campaign.
Ian, have you got any nightmarish reminiscences?
2 minutes to choose from. Well, since John and Sarah are here, I'll share a News International related one. One of the many. There was a period, and I can't remember when it was, but when the Sun had a particular habit of exposing supposed security weaknesses, and the way they would do this was to make fake bombs and then place them in places where they might do harm. So once they flew a helicopter over Parliament with a fake bomb in it and said, "Look, we got a fake bomb over Parliament." And once they managed to get one near Buckingham Palace, and once they managed to get one near wherever Harry was at that point. And I thought it was time they had a bit of a taste of their own medicine. So I decided that we would deliver a fake bomb to the boardroom of News International. And unfortunately for me, at the time, I had a rather brilliant assistant who'd been an art student, a very long story, but she made the most realistic, I mean, I've never seen an actual bomb, but the fake bomb she made was absolutely terrifyingly realistic. And we dispatched a young feature writer called Hadley Freeman, who some of you may now know, if you'll appreciate the absurdity of this. And we had 1 or 2 News International defectors who were working for us, and they gave us detailed plans. And they explained that if you went in through the car park, there was a staircase you could get up, and then you had to turn right at the top of the stairs. And So poor old Hadley was dispatched with a plan to get to the boardroom and her bomb, and I went off to a rather nice lunch, rather nice bibulous lunch actually, which was spoiled only by repeated telephone calls from poor old Hadley Freeman, who was sort of 21 years old and getting increasingly upset because she'd been caught by the rather vigilant News International security staff 3 times trying to get through different emergency exits of the News International building. And eventually I called her up and said, Hadley, don't worry. She was virtually in tears at this point. I said, go home, don't worry, you've done valiantly, brilliant, go home, I'll see you later. And continued for another hour or so to have my rather nice lunch, and then headed back to the Guardian. And when I walked down the street to the Guardian, it was this extraordinary sight because dozens, hundreds of people were pouring out of the front door of the Guardian. And I walked through this sort of tide of journalists, and I eventually said, what the hell's going on? And he said, there's been a bomb found in the fashion cupboard.
So there we are. It can all be a total nightmare, but it can also be fantastically stimulating, and it's still the best job to do. So good luck to all of you. I hope you've had a fantastic time here, and I think we're going to have a few closing words, but thank you to a brilliant panel tonight. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for coming. Thank you so much to our fantastic panel of speakers tonight. What we'd quickly like to say is one of the purposes of tonight was opening a conversation about actually more national collaboration between all the student papers, and this is something that we're really hoping to follow up in the future. So watch this space, basically. Thank you very much.
Sorry, before you all clap, I just want to give you a bit more about what's going to happen now. So this is obviously the team. Please do get in touch with us. I know a lot of people haven't had a chance to see one another this evening. And we're here for about another half an hour or so. Please do stay. I'm afraid the bar's pretty much done now. But get a drink, have a seat, talk to the panelists. And just finally, I'd like to thank you all for coming. You took a chance on this event being enjoyable. I hope you did enjoy it. And thank you to our earlier panel and, of course, to the panel we just heard from. Thank you very much.